and our preliminary interpretation of the structure of being of things at hand, useful things. The phenomenon of reference became visible, but in such a sketchy fashion that, at the same time, we emphasized the necessity of uncovering the phenomenon merely indicated with regard to its ontological origin. Moreover, it became clear that reference and the referential totality were in some sense constitutive of worldliness itself. Until now we have seen the world lit up only in and for particular ways of taking care of what is at hand in the surrounding world, together with its handiness. Thus the further we penetrate into the understanding of the being of inner-worldly beings, the broader and more secure the phenomenal basis for the uncovering the phenomenon of world become. We shall again take our point of departure with the being of what is at hand, with the intention of grasping the phenomenon of reference more precisely. For this purpose, we shall attempt an ontological analysis of the kind of useful thing, in terms of which references can be found in a manifold sense. Such a useful thing can be found in sign. This word names many things. It names not only different kinds of signs, but being a sign for something can itself be formalized to a universal kind of relation, so that the sign structure itself yields an ontological guideline for characterizing any being whatsoever. But signs are themselves initially useful things, whose specific character as useful things consists of indicating Zeichen. Such signs are signposts, boundary stones, the mariner's storm buoy, signals, flags, signs of mourning, and the like. Indicating can be defined as a kind of referring. Taken in an extremely formal sense, to refer means to relate Bezihan. But relation does not function as the genus for species of reference which are differentiated as sign, symbol, expression, and signification. Relation is a formal definition which can be directly read off by way of formalization from every kind of context, whatever its subject matter or way of being. Every reference is a relation, but not every relation is a reference. Every indicating, Zeigung, is a reference, but not every reference is an indicating. This means that every indicating is a relation, but not every relation is an indicating. Thus the formal, universal character of relation becomes apparent. If we investigate such phenomena as reference, sign, or even signification, nothing is to be by characterizing them as relation. Finally, we must even show that relation itself has its ontological origin in reference, because of its formal, universal character. If this analysis is limited to an interpretation of the sign as distinct from the phenomenon of reference, even within this limitation, the full multiplicity of possible signs cannot be adequately investigated. Among signs there are symptoms, signs pointing backward as well as forward, marks, hallmarks whose way of indicating is different regardless of what it is that serves as a sign. We should differentiate these signs from the following: traces, residues, monuments, documents, certificates, symbols, expressions, appearances, signification. These phenomena can easily be formalized on the basis of their formal relational character. We are especially inclined today to subject all beings to an interpretation following the guideline of such a relation, an interpretation which is always correct, because it basically says nothing, no more than the facile scheme of form and content. As an example of a sign, we choose one which shall see again in a later analysis, though in a different regard. Motor cars are equipped with an adjustable red arrow, whose position indicates which direction the car will take, for example, at an intersection. The position of the arrow is regulated by the driver of the car. This sign is a useful thing which is at hand, not only for the heedfulness, steering of the driver. Those who are not in the car, and they especially make use of this useful thing in that they yield accordingly or remain standing. This sign is handy within the world, in the totality of the context of useful things belonging to vehicles and traffic regulation. As a useful thing, this pointer is constituted by reference. It has the character of in order to, its specific serviceability, it is there in order to indicate. The indicating of this sign can be taken as a kind of referring. But here we must note that this referring, as indicating, is not the ontological structure of the sign as a useful thing. As indicating, referring is rather grounded in the structure of being of useful things, in serviceability for. The latter does not automatically make something a sign. The useful thing, hammer, is also characterized by serviceability, but it does not thus become a sign. The referral of indicating is the ontic concretion of the what for of serviceability, and determines a useful thing for that what for. The referral serviceability for, on the other hand, is an ontological, categorical determination of the useful thing as useful thing. The fact that the what-for of serviceability gets its concretion in indicating is accidental to the constitution of the useful thing as such. The distinction between referral as serviceability and referral as indicating became roughly apparent in the example of the sign. The two coincide so little that their unity first makes possible a particular kind of useful thing. But just as surely as indicating is fundamentally different from referral as the constitution of a useful thing, it is just as incontestable that signs have a peculiar and even distinctive relation to the kind of being of the totality of useful things present in the surrounding world and their worldly character. Useful things which indicate have an eminent use in heedful dealing. However, it cannot suffice ontologically simply to ascertain this fact. The ground and meaning of this preeminence must be clarified. What does the indicating of a sign mean? Can only answer this by defining the appropriate way of dealing with things that indicate. In doing this, we must also make their handiness genuinely comprehensible. What is the appropriate way of dealing with signs? Taking our orientation toward the above example, the arrow, we must say that the corresponding behavior Verhalten, being sane, toward the sign encountered is yielding, or remaining still, with reference to the approaching car which has the arrow. As a way of taking a direction, yielding belongs essentially to the being in the world of Dasein. Dasein is always somehow directed and underway. Standing and remaining are only boundary instances of this directed being underway. A sign is not really comprehended when we stare at it and ascertain that it is an indicating thing that occurs. Even if we follow the direction which the arrow indicates and look at something which is objectively present in the region thus indicated, even then the sign is not really encountered. The sign applies to the circumspection of heedful dealings in such a way that the circumspection which follows its direction brings the aroundness of the surrounding world in every instance into an explicit overview, in that compliance. Circumspect overseeing does not comprehend what is at hand. Instead, it acquires an orientation within the surrounding world. Another possibility of experiencing useful things lies in encountering the arrow as a useful thing belonging to the car. Here the arrow's specific character of being a useful thing need not be discovered. What and how it is to indicate can remain completely undetermined, and yet what is encountered is not a mere thing. As opposed to the nearest finding of a multiply undetermined manifold of useful things, the experience of a thing requires its own definiteness. Signs such as we have described let what is at hand be encountered. More precisely, they let their context become accessible in such a way that heedful dealings get and secure for themselves an orientation. Signs are not things which stand in an indicating relationship to another thing. Rather, they are useful things which explicitly bring a totality of useful things to circumspection, so that the worldly character of what is at hand makes itself known at the same time. In symptoms and preliminary indications, what is coming shows itself, but not in the same sense of something merely occurring which is added to what is already objectively present. What is coming is something which we expect or didn't expect insofar as we were busy with other things. What has happened and occurred becomes accessible to our circumspection through signs after it has already happened. Signs indicate what is actually going on. Signs always indicate primarily wherein we live, what our heedfulness is concerned with, what relevance it has. The peculiar character of useful things as signs becomes especially clear in establishing a sign. This happens in and through a circumspect anticipation, which needs the possibility at hand of letting the actual surrounding world make itself known for circumspection through something at hand at any time. But the character of not emerging and keeping to itself, which we described, belongs to the being of inner-worldly beings at hand closest to us. Thus circumspect dealings in the surrounding world needs a useful thing at hand which, in its character of being a useful thing, takes over the work of letting things at hand become conspicuous. Accordingly, the production of such useful things, signs, must take their conspicuousness into consideration. But even as conspicuous things, they are not taken as objectively present arbitrarily, rather they are set up in a definite way with a view toward easy accessibility. But establishing signs does not necessarily have to come about in such a way that a useful thing at hand, which was not yet present at all, is produced. Signs also originate when something already at hand is taken as a sign. In this mode, establishing a sign reveals a still more primordial meaning. Indicating not only creates the circumspectly oriented availability of a totality of useful things and the surrounding world in general, establishing a sign can even discover something for the first time. What is taken as a sign first becomes accessible through its handiness. For example, when the south wind is accepted by the famer as a sign of rain, this acceptance, or the value attached to this being, is not a kind of bonus attached to something already objectively present, that is, the movement of the wind in a certain geographical direction. As this mere occurrence which is meteorologically accessible, the south wind is never initially something objectively present that occasionally takes on the function of an omen. Rather, the farmer's circumspection first discovers the south wind in its being by taking the lay of the land into account. But one will protest. What is taken as a sign must, after all, first have become accessible in itself and must be grasped before the sign is established. To be sure, it must already be there in some way or another. The question simply remains how beings are discovered in this preliminary encounter, whether as something merely occurring and not rather as an uncomprehended kind of useful thing, a thing at hand which one did not know what to do with up to now, which accordingly veiled itself to circumspection. Here again, one must also not interpret the character of useful things at hand, which have not been discovered by circumspection, as mere thingliness, presented for the comprehension of something merely objectively present. Being handy's Zuhendensen of signs in everyday dealings, and the conspicuousness which belongs to signs and can be produced with varying intentions and in different ways, do not only document the inconspicuousness constitutive for what is at hand nearest to us. The sign itself takes its conspicuousness from the inconspicuousness of the totality of useful things at hand in everydayness as a matter of course. For example, the well-known string on one's finger as a reminder. What it is supposed to indicate is always something to be taken care of within the purview of everydayness. This sign can indicate many things of the most diverse sort. The narrowness of intelligibility and use corresponds to the breadth of what can be indicated in such sign. Not only is it mostly at hand as a sign only for the person who establishes it, it can become inaccessible to that same person, so that a second sign is necessary for the possible circumspect applicability of the first one. The string which cannot be used as a sign does not thus lose its sign character, but rather acquires the disturbing obtrusiveness of something near at hand. One could be tempted to illustrate the distinctive role of signs in everyday heedfulness for the understanding of the world itself by citing the extensive use of signs, such as fetishism and magic, in primitive Dasein. Certainly, the establishment of signs that underlies such use of signs does not come about with theoretical intent and by way of theoretical speculation. The use of signs remains completely within an immediate being in the world. But when one looks more closely, it becomes clear that the interpretation of fetishism and magic under the guideline of the idea of signs is not sufficient at all to comprehend the kind of handiness of beings encountered in the primitive world. With regard to the phenomenon of signs, we might give the following interpretation. For primitive people, the sign coincides with what it indicates. The sign itself can represent what it indicates not only in the sense of replacing it, but in such a way that the sign itself always is what is indicated. This remarkable coincidence of the sign with what is indicated does not, however, mean that the sign thing has already undergone a certain objectification, that it has been experienced as a mere thing and been transposed together with what is signified to the same region of being of objective presence. The coincidence is not an identification of hitherto isolated things, but rather the sign has not yet become free from that for which it is a sign. This kind of use of signs is still completely absorbed in the being of what is indicated, so that a sign as such cannot be detached at all. The coincidence is not based on a first objectification, but rather upon the complete lack of such an objectification. But this means that signs are not at all discovered as useful things, that ultimately what is at hand in the world does not have the kind of being of useful things at all. Perhaps this ontological guideline, handiness and useful things, too, can provide nothing for an interpretation of the primitive world, and certainly for an ontology of thingliness. But if an understanding of being is constitutive for primitive Dasein and the primitive world in general, it is all the more urgent to develop the formal idea of worldliness, namely, of a phenomenon which can be modified in such a way that all ontological statements which assert that in a given phenomenal context something is not yet or no longer such, and such may acquire a positive phenomenal meaning in terms of what it is not. Foregoing interpretation of signs should simply offer phenomenal support for our characterization of reference. The relation between sign and reference is threefold. 1. As a possible concretion of the what-for of serviceability, indicating is based upon the structure of useful things in general, upon the in order to reference. 2. As the character of useful things at hand, The indicating of signs belongs to a totality of useful things, to a referential context. 3. Signs are not just at hand along with other useful things. Rather, in their handiness, the surrounding world becomes explicitly accessible to circumspection. Signs is something ontically at hand which, as this definite useful thing, functions at the same time as something which indicates the ontological structure of handiness, referential totality, and worldliness. The distinctive characteristic of these things at hand within the surrounding world, circumspectly taken care of, is rooted here. Thus, reference cannot itself be comprehended as a sign, if it is ontologically to be the foundation for sign. Reference is not the ontic specification of something at hand, since it, after all, constitutes handiness itself. In what sense is reference the ontological presupposition of what is at hand, and as this ontological foundation, to what extent is it at the same time constitutive of worldliness in general?